In this video, we're going to discuss how to select cells and the ranges in VBA. As we discussed in the first part of VBA lecture, there are two keywords for cell selection. One is range, the other is cells. Range allows you to select one or multiple cells, and cells can only select one cell at a time. First, let's talk about the syntax for range. So if you want to select a single cell with range, then you start with the keyword range and then add the parentheses, and inside you specify which cell you want to select. Remember, you have to put a quote here, and this will be the cell name. So A here is the column name and 1 is the row name. So if you go to an Excel spreadsheet, then you should be able to see the column name and the row name and put them in here. And if you want to select multiple cells, you have to use a syntax like this. First of all, using range, you can only select a block of cells. You cannot just randomly select a cell here, a cell here, a cell here. You have to select a block of cells like this. And in order to select this block, you need to specify the upper left corner and the lower right corner. So you know the location of these corners and put these corners into your range. That will allow you to select this whole block. This is the upper left corner and this is the lower right corner. In between, you need a colon. And to select a block, there's an alternative syntax. In this syntax, again, you have to specify the upper left corner and the lower right corner. But instead of using a colon to connect the two, you quote, first of all, you quote both corners and use comma to separate them. Okay. So you need to know both ways to select the block of a cell. The syntax for cells is relatively straightforward. First of all, notice there's no letters involved here, just two integers. This is the row number, so the 10th row, and this is the column number, the first column. Okay. And the cells only allow you to select one cell at a time. And the other cool thing about cells and range is that you can possibly combine the two to select a block of cells. For example, let's take a look at this expression. Notice that outside structure of this expression is this third one right here. We're using this syntax for range to select a block of cells, and we're going to specify the upper left corner and the lower right corner. But instead of using this quoted cell name to select them, we use cells expression to specify the upper left corner and the lower right corner. I'm going to give you a minute to think about which block of cells does this expression select. Okay, take a minute to think about this. You can pause the video. The first cell's expression says it's the first row and the first column. The second cell's expression says it's the third row and the third column in your spreadsheet. So this one is going to be the upper left corner in your range, and this one is going to be the lower right corner. Therefore, the range would select this entire block. Okay, from the very first cell in your spreadsheet to this cell. This is some flexibility in using range and cells. Now let's look at an example. So let's copy this subroutine I provided, Control-C, and then let's go to a workbook. Remember, use Alt-11. We can open the VBA editor, and we're going to insert a module into our workbook and copy the subroutine over into this workbook. Let's run this subroutine. Don't worry about the first two lines. I'm just trying to clear everything in the workbook. But since if you open a new workbook, then there should be nothing there in the first place. So don't worry about these two lines. Let's start with this line here. Okay. Before we run this code, let's try to expect what's going to be the outcome, right? So the first one says range A13. So you know that this is just selecting cell A13. Value means the content of the cell. So we're putting number 50 into this cell. Okay, so the second one, so this is for a block of cells starting at A14, ending at B15. Again, we're changing the content. We're putting A, B, C, this 3 letters, into these cells. The next one, again, is selecting a block. So starting at C14, ending at D15, and we're putting number 20 into these cells within the block. Finally, we have the cells. So this means the 10th row, the second column, and we're changing the content to this date. Okay. So let's use F8 to run this code line by line. First of all, put number 50 in A13. You can see 50 now is in A13. Second of all, put ABC in A14 through B15. So A14 through B15 is here. That's the block, right? So let's see what happens if you run the code. So ABC now is in every cell in that block. And then we put number 20 in another block from C14 to D15. Okay, so that's C14 to D15. Finally, we put this date in the 10th row and the second column. So that the date now is in the 10th row and the second column. Okay. And then we end the program. So this is how to refer to cells and the range in VBA. Before we move on to the next topic, I want you to recall what we discussed in the first part of the lecture. There I said that to refer to a cell in VBA, you can start with the top level, right? You can start with application and then specify the workbook name and then specify the worksheet name and then specify the cell name. But you can also omit those upper level objects and just directly start with cell. Okay? So that's what I'm doing here. So I start directly with the cell, which means Excel will assume that you mean the currently active workbook and the currently active worksheet. Okay. So now, because I only have one workbook open and it only has one worksheet, so I can safely omit those upper level objects. So that's why I did that. But if you have multiple workbooks, multiple worksheets, then you have to be careful. Okay. Just to remind you what we talked about last time. Okay, so let's continue our discussion. Here I want to tell you that the range keyword has a shorthand. So to refer to cell A1 using range, you say range quote A1. That's the full expression. And this is the same as saying bracket A1. So you can either use range A1 or use bracket A1. Okay. Similarly, if you want to refer to a block, say A1 to B5, you can replace range by bracket, say A1 to B5. So these expressions would work. But it's very important to keep in mind that this alternative expression of range cannot be replaced by A1 comma B5. So this expression does not give you a block from A1 to B5. So you have to be careful with this expression. You cannot do this shorthand for a block of cells. Here I give you another example where I replace the range keyword with those shorthands. I want you to run this code in VBA and see the outcome. So the next topic is the end property of cells. Before I talk about this property, I want to remind you of a shortcut we discussed earlier in this course. So let's go back to our Excel workbook here. This shortcut is Control arrow key. For example, if you start with any cell, for example, if you start somewhere in a table and you would like to move to the last cell in the same column, also within that table, then a shortcut you can use is Control down arrow. Control down arrow takes you to the last cell in the same column. Similarly, if you start somewhere in a table and you want to go to the last cell in the same row, you can do Control right arrow. Okay. Control right arrow takes you to the last cell in the same row within that table. In VBA, we can replace this Control arrow key combination with the AND property. Let's see how we do that. Here I provide you an example code. We're going to run this code in a minute, but before we do that, I want to explain what the code does. This line here, obviously, we're just selecting cell A1. This line here, we're saying A1 and the AND property. This is the AND property. Okay. Again, we use the dot to connect a cell to its AND property. Inside the AND property, we're saying XL down, and we want to select. So this line is the same as selecting A1 and then press Control down arrow. In other words, we first start with A1 and then we go to the last cell in the same column. So AND XL down is the same as Control down arrow. Okay. Similarly, the next line says start with A1 and then do Control right. So XL to right is the same as Control right. And this next line is getting a little more complicated. To understand this line, first let's recall this syntax for range we talked about. In order to select a block of cells using range, one way is to specify the upper left corner of the block, and then comma, and then the lower right corner of the block. Okay. So we're using this syntax here. Specifically, you can see before the comma here, we have A1. So that means the upper left corner of your block here is cell A1. But when we select the lower right corner, instead of specifying the name of that cell, we use this AND property to find that cell. So we start with range A1 and then say XL down. So this is the same as selecting A1 first and then do Control down arrow. From our previous discussion, we know that this expression gives us the last cell in the same column as A1. So that will be our lower right corner of the range. The next line here does something similar, except we're using Control right to find the lower right corner. So let's copy our code here. And for us to be able to see results, let's just randomly type some data in these cells. Doesn't matter what the data is. Mainly I want to see the cell selection. Okay, just type something into this block. Now let's run our code using F8. Select into the subroutine and press F8. So before I run this line, like we discussed, this line just selects cell A1. So now you can see that the selection is at A1. The next line selects the last cell in the same column as A1. Right? So this is the same as pressing Control down arrow after selecting A1. So from this table, before we run the code, you should expect the selection should be at A5 in my example. Because right now, if I press Control down arrow, it should take me to A5. So that's what XL down does. So let's run that. The selection is at A5. The next says that starting from A1 and then do Control right. So if you start from A1 and do Control right, in my example, it should take me to C1. Let's see that. And then the next line, as we discussed, select the range starting at A1, ending at A1 XL down. So we know that A1 XL down, in my case, should be A5. So this range starts at A1, ends at A5. Right? So that means it's the first column in my table. And we're going to change the color of that range to red. The next line says, this is a range that starts at B1, ends at A1 XL right. First, let's figure out where is A1 XL right. Remember, A1 XL right is the same cell as starting from A1 and do Control right. So that should take you to C1. Therefore, the range here should be from B1 to C1. And we're going to change the color of that range to blue. So that's our discussion of the AND property. Just to summarize, AND XL down is the same as doing Control down. And XL up is the same as doing Control up. XL to right is the same as Control right. XL to left is the same as Control left. Another useful property for range is the offset property. So what offset property does is it allows you to specify a position relative to a cell. For example, let's take a look at this line. So this line, first of all, specify cell A1. And then it says offset 0, 3. So here, offset has two integers in it. The first integer is the relative row position. The second integer is the relative column position. Here, 0 means do not change the row. 3 means add 3 to the column number. The cell we're trying to select is 3 columns away from A1. The cell we're selecting is A1, B1, C1, D1. So we start with cell A1 and increase 3 columns. And this is our selection. Let's look at the next line here. Again, we start with cell A1. The offset says that we want to add 3 to the row number and do not change the column number. Okay. So we add 3 to the row number. We get to A4. Okay, now let's copy our code into Excel so we can observe the outcome. Again, let's select into the subroutine and use F8 to run line by line. The first line says select A1. Now A1 is selected. And then the second one says starting from A1, we're going to add 3 to the column number, so we should be at B1. And the next one says, starting from A1, add 3 to the row number, so that should take us to A4. And the next one says, we're going to start from A1, and we're going to add 3 to the row number. Okay? So that should take us from A1 to A4, as we have seen before. And then we're going to start from A4 and then add 3 to the column number. So first of all, we start from A1 and we get to A4. And then from there, we add 3 to the column number. So that should take us to D4. Let's see how it works. Okay, this last line says that we start from A1. First of all, we do control down. So from this table, you can see that if I start from A1, do control down, that takes me to A5, right? That's the last cell in the same column. And then from A5, I'm going to add 3 to the column number. So that should take us from A5 to D5. You can see, finally, we selected D5. So the last example shows you that you can combine the AND property and offset property. Okay, to summarize, in this part of the lecture, we discussed how to use range and cells to select a single cell or a block of cells. And then we discussed how to use the AND property and the offset property to select cells relative to other cells. Here I provided 2 mini projects for you to practice the skills we just learned. Again, these mini projects are discussed in a separate video. Please try these mini projects and compare your answer with the answers I provided in the other video. For the second mini project, you will need another technique that I haven't discussed so far. This technique allows you to call any Excel function from VBA. Let's take a look at an example. We know that Excel provides a lot of built-in functions that allows you to do different calculations. For example, let's say that I want to calculate the sum of these 3 numbers. So obviously, you know that we can do sum and then from A1 to A3. That would give me the sum of these 3 numbers. And you can perform the same task in VBA. You can call the sum function inside VBA. Let's see how we do that. Say I want to do the same calculation and put my result here in F1. I will say that F1 dot value equal to, remember this means I'm assigning some value to cell F1. So what is that value? That value is the sum of those 3 cells. In order to do that, you start with application. Remember, from our first part of the lecture, we know that application means Excel itself, the software. Right? So here you have to include application. You cannot omit this. And then we specify the function name. The function we're trying to call is sum function. And inside sum function, we need to specify what's the range of the sum. Here, as we discussed earlier, there are different ways to specify the range from A1 to A3. So I'm going to choose one of these methods. So I can do A1 to A3. Okay, now let's run our code. So you can see that the VBA code would calculate the total of these 3 numbers and put that in F1. For the second mini project, you will need to use this skill. And you can do this for any Excel built-in function. But just remember to include application at the beginning.